Welcome to and good morning to our friends in Thailand and good afternoon to our colleagues here in Australia. My name is Mary Rains. I'm the Barley Markets Manager for AGIC, the Australian Export Grains Innovation Centre, and I will be your MC for today's event. It's great to see so many people online and people have a lot of interest in the Australian feed grain and sprouted wheat webinar that we have here for you today. We've got a lot on our program with some key speakers, and we've also this event is also simultaneously translated, so you can get value out of it and hear this webinar in your own preferred language. Being a simultaneous translated webinar, on the bottom of the Zoom function, scroll along to the bottom and click the globe to select your preferred language. A few other housekeeping items for this webinar. I will introduce all the speakers. We'll hold all the questions over to the Q&A session. And if you have any questions, please insert that into the Q&A chat function box at the bottom of your screen there. Also, to ensure that Australia continues to deliver value to our friends in Thailand, we have a poll at the end of this webinar that we'd like to receive your feedback to ensure that we've got content and information that you gain value from. So I'm really, really excited to be presenting to you today because Australia has just started its harvest for 2022. So to officially open today's webinar, we've got Mr. Michael Hallerman, who is the Senior Trade and Investment Commission for Thailand. Michael leads the Austrade team in Bangkok, which is focused on growing Australia's trade, investment and education relationships with Thailand. Following Michael, we have Mr. Lloyd George. Mr. Lloyd George is an independent grain market analyst and has a career spanning over 30 years in the grain trading industry. 17 of that is in the international markets. Mr. Lloyd George also writes weekly news articles for the national newspapers on grain marketing. He also leads grain marketing workshops with Grain Trade Australia and builds on his business of market analytics. Today, Lloyd will be speaking about the 2022-2023 Australian grain harvest update. He'll be talking about feed wheat and the feed grain outlook. So welcome back to Lloyd George. He'll be a familiar face to you. Following Lloyd, we have Tony Edwards. Tony Edwards is an Australian animal nutritionist who has been involved in commercial feed milling, livestock production, research and industry training for 45 years. Tony specialises in pig nutrition and welfare and has consulted widely throughout Asia, including Japan, Korea, China, Philippines, Vietnam, Malaysia, Indonesia, India and Pakistan. And I think, Tony, you've been here virtually 3 times into Thailand as well. Tony has also consulted for large companies such as DSM, Alltech, Bioman, DuPont and Adieso. Today, it's great to have Tony back presenting to you on pig and poultry uses of Australian feed grains, including sprouted wheat. Thank you, Tony. Following Tony, we've got Dr. Steve Little, is a principal consultant at Capacity Plus Ag Consultancy Company here in Australia. He's a ruminant expert and a doctor of veterinarian. Dr. Stephen provides support on dairy herd nutrition, reproduction health and productivity. Dr. Steve has worked many years with Australia's largest compound feed manufacturer, so he has a very good understanding of the roles, challenges and opportunities faced by feed producers globally. It's great to have Dr. Steve back speaking today, and his presentation will be feeding weather-damaged grains to dairy and beef cattle. Following Dr. Stephen, we'll roll into our Q&A session, so please ensure to ask us a lot of questions. And closing out this event, we're really pleased to have this Miss Amber Parr, the Councillor for Agriculture with the Department of Agriculture, Fisheries and Forestries, the Australian Government, based in Bangkok, Thailand. Miss Parr is the Agricultural Councillor covering Thailand, the Philippines, Singapore, Myanmar, and has an extensive career with the Australian Government as a Director of the Department of Agricultural, Fisheries and Forestry. So we're really pleased to have Miss Parr back here with us today. So with no further ado, sit back, relax, ensure you're in the right channel to hear this webinar, and I'd like to hand over to Michael Hallerman.
Thank you very much, Mary, and it's my pleasure to be here this morning. Could I welcome all our Thai partners to the event today, and also welcome our Australian presenters. It's an eminent group of presenters that we have today. It's been a very significant year in the bilateral relationship between Australia and Thailand. It is the 70th anniversary of bilateral relations between our two countries. And over the last couple of weeks, Thailand has hosted the APEC Forum, which saw the leaders of about 20 significant economies in the Asia Pacific region, including Australia, come to Thailand. And in fact, Prime Minister Albanese, the Australian Prime Minister, led the Australian delegation here only a couple of weeks ago. We've also had visits from Australia's Foreign Minister over the last month or so, Penny Wong, and several other senior ministers. And more broadly, over the last couple of years, including through COVID, the trade and investment relationship between our two countries has continued to go from strength to strength. And when we look at the agribusiness sector, it really is a partnership between Australia and Thailand with high quality produce flowing in both directions, particularly being facilitated by a very strong set of trading architecture, including the Thailand-Australia Free Trade Agreement and also the ASEAN Australia-New Zealand FTA. So it's a very strong and positive relationship across many sectors. Agribusiness is crucial to both our countries' economies, and I'm delighted that our Thai partners can hear from such an eminent group of Australians today. I wish you very well for the presentation. Thank you, and back to you, Mary.
Thank you, Michael. We'll commence the webinar for everybody.
Good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure to be with you today. My name is Lloyd George. I'm a grain market analyst based in Australia, and today I'm going to be giving you an update on Australia's feed grain supplies for the 22-23 season. Just a quick snapshot overview to start with. The season that, as Mary said, we've just started harvest. It's been a delayed start to harvest because of the wetter than normal season. Australia has seen its third consecutive La Nina with the wetter than normal conditions, and that has resulted in our third consecutive large winter crop harvest. Harvest is underway, probably a little bit less than 20%, moving along quickly. We've just had a warm, dry week in Australia, and the forecast is for another one this week. So things have started to move quickly. It will be a near record large wheat crop. But quality is expected to suffer with the big yields, like very similar to last year. Protein contents will be down on average, and there's also likely to be some weather downgrading. We're also expecting a near record large barley harvest, because of the big wheat crop and large barley crop, we're going to see large grain exportable surpluses again, and a larger than normal proportion of that is expected to be feed grains. On the other hand, our sorghum exports for the 22-23 season are likely to decline. Let me get into a little bit more detail. Another large winter crop after a favourable year. It will be our third consecutive 50 million tonne plus winter grain harvest made up of the wheat, barley and oats. The main winter crops, excluding the pulses and canola. Favourable growing conditions has meant bumper yields, and so very good for crop size. But with those big yields, quality is expected to suffer. The wheat and barley quality is expected to decline with the high yields, but also the wet weather through October and November. I'll draw your attention to this weather map here. It is the rainfall in percentage terms that Australia had seen in October. The dark purple represents 4 times the normal rainfall for the month, and a lot of the East Coast got that. It resulted that weather continued into November. There was extensive flooding through New South Wales and parts of Victoria. And with that, there will be an extent of weather downgrading because of that. As I mentioned earlier on, the proteins to be wheat proteins are expected to be lower than normal. We're already seeing that in the early part of the harvest. In some states more than others. ASW is expected to be the dominant wheat grade. And the higher milling grades, hard 2 and APW are expected to be scarcer than normal. The worst of the weather that we've actually seen on the East Coast was through New South Wales, and just a little bit of geography. This is New South Wales here. And so this is where the worst of the flooding has actually been. The barley quality has also suffered. Lower test weights on the barley, and a little bit of discoloration on the barley with the rain as well. While the large wheat barley production, the sorghum production, summer crop production in Australia is expected to suffer. That same rainfall that I spoke of through October and November, through New South Wales and extending into Queensland, whilst it's those wheat and barley crops are largely ready to be harvested in late October and into November. That's delayed the harvest, but also it's prevented a lot of summer crop from being planted. Those crops are normally going into the ground in October, and the excessive rain limited the amount of summer crops that can be planted, including sorghum. So the sorghum production is expected to fall, one with a decline in summer crop plantings, but also a return to average yields following some bumper yields last year. And the result of that will be a smaller sorghum crop, and that will result in smaller sorghum exports, albeit those sorghum exports really don't start until March, April, and extend through the year. Now, I just want to cast your eye to a little bit of history. to give you an idea of where Australia's barley and wheat exports have been actually heading, and what this is likely to mean for the 22-23 season. Back in 1990, the 2019-20 year, Australia was still under drought. Small wheat exports, relatively small barley exports as well. But the next 3 years, as I said, big crops. The 22-23 season is the one that we're talking about now, just being harvested. So expecting very similar wheat and barley exports to last year. Expecting wheat exports around about 26 million tonnes, which by historical standards, very large. This year in itself here, the 21-2, in fact, record large, 27.3 million tonnes of exports. So we're expecting another big export year. The destinations for that, China was the largest importer of Australian wheat last year, 6.1 million tonnes. We're expecting another large exportable surplus. Some of that was, in fact, downgraded quality wheat, a mix of weathered wheat from last year, but also low protein wheat. Expecting quite similar this year. We're expecting about 15 million tonnes going to other parts of Asia, and then similar volumes going into the Middle East and Africa, and a little bit closer to Australia into the Pacific region, including New Zealand and the likes of Fiji. In terms of barley, again, another big barley exportable year. The barley exports, Saudi Arabia is expected to remain Australia's largest destination, taking about 3 million tonnes. Down here, Japan has been sourcing nearly all of its barley from Australia now because of competitive pricing, expecting a similar thing to continue. But also expecting that we'll see those competitive prices for barley. Will continue to see barley exports going into feed grain markets through Southeast Asia, including Thailand. And then on top of that, we've got other Middle Eastern countries and other destinations, a smaller volume. In terms of the sorghum exports that I mentioned earlier on, this is a monthly chart of Australia's sorghum exports right up until September, which is the last month of the export data has been published by the Australian Bureau of Statistics. And we've seen large exports, about 1.85 million tonnes exported in the January to September, with China, the blue, taking the bulk of that, about 1.55 million tonnes. Smaller volumes going to Japan and other destinations. So what we're expecting is that those exports are likely to decline by upwards of 750,000 tonnes in the 22-23 season, when that crop becomes mature and gets harvested, which doesn't happen until kind of the late in the first quarter of 2023. With the large crops in Australia, it means large exportable surpluses, and for Australia to move those volumes, Australia's grain prices need to be competitive. This is a chart going back to the beginning of 2019, and it includes Australian feed barley. The green, the prices quoted are International Grains Council prices, and the green being barley, the yellow being US corn as a benchmark of global feed grain prices, and ASW in the blue, and sorghum in the red. Back here, tail end of drought in Australia. So Australian feed grain prices and Australian grain prices in general were at big premiums to global feed grain prices, because we're still experiencing drought. The market here was trying to hold feed grades back at home and get it into positions where the domestic market needed it. Whereas once we got into the large crops, Australian grain prices have been globally competitive to move the volumes into export destinations, including Southeast Asia and the likes of Thailand. This pattern is going to continue through the 22-23 season to ensure that those exports remain large, so that process is already underway. Now, these large exports are going to be limited by capacity constraints. The chart to the left is Australia's monthly wheat, barley, and canola exports. Wheat being the blue, wheat, barley, and canola. Wheat being the blue, barley, orange, and grey on the canola. And what you'll see, and what the chart clearly shows, is that where Australia's monthly export capacity maxes out, and that's at around about just over 4 million tonnes per month. And so over and above that, it's that is maximum capacity. We reached a high of 4.2 million tonnes in February 2022, that's the high watermark. And so we're going to have those constraints are going to remain in the 22-23 season. The export bookings of that shipping capacity are already fully committed, right through the season. And my understanding is exporters are largely sold already out through to February and even into March now. And so what this means is that the export capacity to go in and push out additional tonnes over and above this, even if that demand is there into Asia and other countries, is limited and is capped. So it's one to be aware of. Now, just recapping on the messages that I want to leave you with. Another big crop in Australia means large exportable supplies. Very similar to the past two seasons. Australia's expected to export around about 26 million tonnes of wheat, 8 million tonnes of barley, and while the sorghum exports are expected to be slightly down on last year. Lower quality is expected on wheat, and that is going to push more wheat into feed grain export channels than average. Australia's wheat and barley prices are expected to remain competitive through there to facilitate another season of large exports. There's capacity constraints on there. On the quality of the crop, we're still discovering it because we're only 20% through to harvest. But there have been some patches of better than expected quality, so that's likely to constrain the volume of downgraded wheat that we could see, but we've still got a large proportion of harvest to go. And as I just mentioned, the shipping stem is fully booked, so exporter capacity to come in and meet spot demand is going to be limited. Thank you for your time, and I look forward to taking any questions you may have a little bit later on. Now, what I'd like to do is to pass you across to Tony Edwards, and Tony's going to be talking to you on feeding grains into pig and poultry diets. Thank you, and over to you, Tony.
Thanks very much, Lloyd. My name, as Lloyd mentioned, is Tony Edwards. I'm an animal nutritionist here in Australia, and it's my pleasure today to talk to you about the use of Australian feed grains in pig and poultry diets, with a particular emphasis today on sprouted wheat. The key messages I'd like to deliver today are the fact that pig and poultry production is competitive and cost sensitive. And in fact, it's been very cost sensitive in the last year or so, with the escalation in feed raw material costs. And so as feed is the biggest single cost in the livestock production equation, we need to be flexible in regard to the ingredients that we use. Unfortunately, pigs and poultry are very adaptable omnivores that can meet their nutrient requirements from a broad range of different feeds. Australian diets, for instance, use mainly barley, wheat, sorghum, and legumes, and canola meal, and with excellent results. Corn and soy are the mainstays of the Southeast Asian feed market, but they're essentially, or not essential for these diets. We can do diets without corn and soy to a large extent, and the Australian situation certainly demonstrates that. This year, Australia will produce a large volume of feed grains, as Lloyd's mentioned, and it comes as the third year in a row now that we've had some very big harvests. And these Australian feed grains are very accessible to the Southeast Asian feed scene, and they're very attractively priced and well worth considering. I'm just having some trouble getting that to go. This slide here is just giving you a visual of the different grains that we might use in feedstuffs around the world. And certainly here in Australia, we're talking wheat and barley and sorghum as our predominant grains, but we will use oats and triticale and rye, and to some extent rice and millet when it's available. We use very little corn in Australia. There's very little corn grown here, and we have very competitive alternatives. So we focus our diets mainly on these other three grains. As well as that, of course, we do use a significant proportion of grain legumes in our diets, things like lupins and peas and faba beans in particular, but also chickpeas, mung beans and lentils. All these have very good food value. They are somewhat intermediate between cereal grains and protein meals, and the protein quality within them is quite good, and they can effectively assist in displacing soybean out of diets. This table here shows the typical analyses of the different feed grains, and I'm only going to cover this particular aspect of the feed grain usage in relatively brief terms today, because we've run many of these webinars on the application of Australian feed grains into diets in Southeast Asia, And I would recommend anybody listening, if they wanted to follow up these in more detail, that all these webinars are available on the AGIC website. So if you wish to look into that in more detail, you can certainly do so. But just to sort of give you a quick overview, when we compare these grains here, like wheat and barley, relative to corn, the main features are that they tend to be higher in protein than corn, but lower in fat. In the case of barley here, it has a higher fibre fractions in the seed, and as a consequence, lower starch. And subsequent to that, of course, it has a relatively lower energy value here compared to corn. But all these values are not absolute, in as much that all these grains can vary depending on the agronomic conditions under which they're grown. And so they will vary, and we need to assess each individual sample in terms of its protein, fat, fibre, starch content, etc., and then realign the energy values according to that profile. And we have a very good facility here in Australia called AusScan, which is a near-infrared reflectance technology that allows us to rapidly assess the energy value of particular samples of grain. And we've made very good use of that. But one of the features here of the protein of the grains like wheat and barley is that their protein content, as I mentioned, is relatively high compared to corn. And as a consequence, they can actually partially replace some of the soybean requirement in the diet. So you get a dual action here of a cereal replacement, but also a partial protein replacement as well. If we look at the same analyses here, but this time, rather than talking big energy values, I'm now talking poultry energy values, and you can see that there's a similar lower value here for barley relative to corn, etc. But this is not necessarily an impediment. We can reformulate the diets to accommodate this aspect, and as long as the price is right, they can still be very competitive alternatives in most stock feeds. One feature of the poultry analyses here is the energy values are very much responsive to the use of non-starch polysaccharide enzymes. And so by applying these enzymes, we can deal with the components that the NSP components in wheat and barley, and make them fully utilizable by the animal and bring their energy values up closer to that of corn. In terms of the amino acids, if we look here at this table of the standard ileal digestible amino acids for each of the grains at their typical protein levels, you can see that, again, wheat and barley generally deliver more of those standard ileal digestible amino acids than does corn. And this is, in fact, the aspect that allows it to displace some of the soybean requirement out of the diets. So what I'd like to focus now on is sprouted wheat, because this is a particular opportunity that comes along from time to time. And at the moment, we're enjoying an option here that there is sprouted wheat about, as there was last year due to the wet harvest. So just to run through the aspects of sprouted wheat, the Australian wheat harvest can occasionally be interrupted by wet weather. And we've certainly seen this recently across Southeast Australia, as Lloyd has mentioned. And this can result in the mature grain still in the head being subjected to sufficient moisture to induce the onset of germination. This process is also known as sprouting and can occur to a variable extent depending on the conditions experienced. So what does this involve, and what are the implications for the feeding value of the grain? Just to explain sprouting, first of all, cereal grains primarily store their energy in the form of starch. During germination, the starch is hydrolyzed to glucose, which then acts as a fuel to feed the emerging shoot. When this occurs, the grain is described as having sprouted, even if it hasn't actually produced a shoot or shot, as we say. And the level of sprouting can vary depending on the extent to which the process has proceeded. And how do we measure this degree of sprouting? Well, we can simply look at the seeds visually under a microscope and see if we can identify those seeds that appear to have sprouted. And we accept the fact that sound wheat probably allows up to 4% sprouted kernels. However, some milling grade standards set mill tolerance on sprouting and actually rely on the falling number test to identify the extent of sprouting. So what the falling number test is doing is actually measuring the starch integrity. When the starch is hydrolyzed by the alpha amylase enzyme, it changes the integrity and physical properties of the starch. The falling number test involves measuring the time required for a metal stirrer or ball bearing to fall through a column of gelled starch. Raw, unhydrolyzed or high integrity starch will record a falling number of around 300 to 400 seconds, while extensively hydrolyzed starch, which has been largely converted to sugar, will record a low falling number figure of possibly 65 seconds. So just to picture what this falling number test is about, first thing, this graph here shows the falling number relationship along the bottom of the graph relative to the alpha amylase activity up the side here. And what we see is that when the alpha amylase activity is very low or nil, then there's a relatively high falling number value. But as the alpha amylase activity increases, then the falling number declines quite rapidly. And the way this is measured is by putting a ground sample of wheat into a test tube here with water and mixing it into a gel, and then placing that in a water bath to heat it up. And then we run through this standard process here where we have 5 seconds of standing time, then 55 seconds of stirring, and then the stirrer is released and it falls down through the gelled starch at a differential rate depending on the viscosity of the starch. And so with a very high quality starch, it's quite viscous and it takes up to 400 seconds for that instrument to fall to the bottom. But when the starch has been hydrolyzed to sugar, the solution is relatively thin and that stirrer falls to the bottom very quickly. And so in this instance here, we can see that the falling number on this sample involved the 5 seconds of standing, this 55 seconds of stirring, and then 240 seconds for the stirrer to fall through the medium, adding up to a total of a score of 300 seconds as the falling number. And finally, this photo here is just indicative of the bread characteristics associated with the falling number. And when the falling number is very high at around 400, the baking properties are excellent. As the falling number declines, the baking properties start to decline. And by the time it gets down to these low falling numbers, it's just about impossible to bake bread from the flour associated with that. So around 200 seems to be about the break point, where below that the feed is considered of less value. So just to reiterate that, what's the significance of this falling number? Well, starch integrity is an important baking property of wheat flour. A high falling number is required to achieve the dough characteristics necessary to bake bread. As the falling number declines, the wheat is deemed less suitable for baking flour and may be discounted to feed wheat. And I've nominated a threshold there of possibly 200 on the falling number test. And so what is the relevance of this sprouting, though, to the livestock feeding value for the grain? Well, this to a large extent depends on the extent or degree of sprouting. If the grain is simply sprung, as we say, and this is where the process starts, the gusset area on the seed becomes swollen, but the seed is still intact and there's no shoot. This indicates that the hydrolysis of the starch to sugars is underway, but there is no nutrient loss from the seed. And as animals digest starch by hydrolysis in their normal digestive process, they break the starch down to glucose. And so if there is some degree of pre-hydrolysis in the seed, this can be seen as an advantage. It certainly improves the palatability and to some extent the digestibility of the grain. However, once the seed has shot, and that is that a shoot starts to emerge, the energy reserves are then being drained to fuel the growth of that shoot, and the energy value of that grain to the animal declines. As this proceeds, the feeding value declines in proportion to the extent of sprouting. Just to give you a concept of what we're talking about here, this is just a cross-section of the wheat kernel here, showing the germ area at the bottom and the endosperm of the seed. And if we take that across into a more diagrammatic form, you can see this. The two areas we're interested in here are really the starchy endosperm and what's happening here in the germ area, or what we would call the gusset region of the seed. Once the germination has been initiated, then enzymes are released from the germ into the endosperm, and they start the process of converting the starch into sugars. And this swelling of the gusset can be seen here in these photos as indicative of sprung wheat. All the contents are still inside that seed, but it is showing signs that it has begun the germination process. And this can proceed almost to completion within the seed without any emergence of the shoot. So we can have full hydrolysis of the starch to glucose, but still no shoot emerging. This grain is still considered sprung rather than shot. But then ultimately a shoot will emerge, of course, and we call this shot wheat. And what we see here is the shoot comes out from the germ and starts to draw on the sugar supply here to fuel its growth. And these are just photos of actual sprouting wheat to give you a more practical idea of what's happening. And that, of course, will advance further with time. And as it advances further, you can see that it starts to shrivel the grain as the sugar reserves are drawn out into the shoot. And at this point in time, the energy value of that grain is starting to decline quite noticeably. So just to summarise the stages in this process, we start off here with normal wheat, with the starches of high integrity and unhydrolyzed. And what we would normally measure here is a test weight in the order of 75 to 80 kilos per hectolitre, a falling number of around 300 to 400. The digestible energy value for pigs of this particular grain is usually in the order of 14 to 14.2 megajoules, and the corresponding poultry ME value is around 3100 to 3200. Once the germination or sprouting begins and the hydrolysis starts, we can see that there's no change in the test weight of the grain. There is a decline in the falling number as we get further hydrolysis of the starch, but there's no change in the energy value for either pigs or poultry. And similarly out here, when it's fully hydrolyzed and most of the starch has been converted to sugar, there's still no change in the test weight of the grain. The falling number may now have declined almost to its minimum, but again, there is no change in the energy value of the grain for the animals. All the goodness is still entrapped inside that seed. It's not until this shoot emerges that we start to see some changes. And what we'll see here, as the shoot starts to draw the sugar out of the kernel of the grain, the test weight will decline. The falling number will now generally be right at its minimum. and we'll see a compromise here to the energy value of the grain. And as that shoot proceeds further, of course, we'll see more marked reductions in the test weight. There's a low falling number, of course, but an even more extensive reduction here in the energy value for both pigs and poultry. So when we talk about sprouted grain, we have to be very clear about the extent to which it's sprouted to recognise what its food value is. But until the shoot emerges, there is no change in the food value of the grain for livestock. There are some other considerations that we need to consider when the moisture levels are high enough to induce germination. They may also increase the risk of molds and mycotoxins, and we need to monitor these by normal QA methodology. Other aspects we need to consider here too is that the receival or handling of this grain needs to observe the normal moisture receival standards, and so we need to have the grain below 12.5% moisture. If we receive it above that level, then the grain will not store well. And but what we do know is once it does come down to that level, then the sprouting process stops. So it becomes quite stable if we can get the moisture back within the normal operating levels. There has been some comment that the reduced starch integrity in the seed may influence the pelleting characteristics of the grain, but I believe this is a minor consequence. We've had a lot of this sprouted wheat used in stock feed milling in the last year in particular, and we've noticed very little consequences as far as pellet quality is concerned. So the nutrient status of the sprouted grain, it really does depend on the stage of sprouting, and until the shoot emerges, there is no loss of nutrient from the seed. So until we can see an actual physical shoot or emerging from the grain, we can consider it as normal wheat. The starch is hydrolyzed to glucose or to maltose, but the energy value remains the same. So there are changes in the seed, but as far as the animal is concerned, the energy values remain constant. And there's no other changes in the other characteristics. Things like the protein level remains the same. The amino acid content within the protein remains normal. The fat, the fiber, and the minerals, etc., all remain as they were. There may actually be a slight increase in the availability of minerals due to the concurrent release of endogenous phytase during the germination process. Seeds store their phosphorus as phytate-bound phosphorus, and it's just a natural process that they release an enzyme to break up that phytate to release that phosphorus as part of the germination process. And in doing so, of course, it makes that phosphorus more available to the animal. But the bottom line of all this analysis is that sprouted wheat essentially can be treated as normal wheat for most situations. And the only rider here is that unless there is extensive shooting, which would normally be reflected in reduced test weight. So as long as we're doing most of the normal QA tests on the grain, there should be no surprises as such in terms of the nutritive value. It should be equivalent to normal wheat as long as it meets all the QA parameters. And so what are these QA measures that we should undertake? Well, firstly, we have to check the moisture. The moisture needs to be below 12.5%. The test weight is preferably going to be 75 kilos per hectolitre or higher. But it may well be that the energy isn't really compromised until the energy value or the test weight declines closer to 70 kilos per hectolitre. So in terms of protein, we would determine this by the normal Kjeldahl nitrogen test. We can presume with confidence that the amino acid values within there are in the normal proportion to the protein. And we can also assume that the standard ileal digestibility values for those amino acids are as per normal wheat, because there's no heat involved in this process and there's no likelihood that they will be denatured in any way. The best way to assess the energy of that material really is through the near-infrared reflectance technology I mentioned before called AusScan, which gives a very rapid real-time assay of the energy value of the grain for all classes of livestock, be it pig, poultry, cattle, etc. We have to be aware of mycotoxins, and we would like them sampled to be free of mycotoxins, of course, or within within a certain tolerance range. And if we can identify which mycotoxins are involved, then we can take appropriate remedial action to deal with them in terms of mycotoxin binders. And finally, the falling number test. This is of no concern at all. It's of no relevance to animal feeding. And so we don't really need to be concerned if the sample records a low falling number. It's not going to affect its energy value at all. What I've done in this next table is just quickly present some example pig grower diets based on sprouted wheat relative to corn. In the corn diet here, I've just used corn and cassava and rice bran and DDGS, the typical sort of feed components that are maybe available in Southeast Asia. And I've produced a diet here of around 14.4 megajoules DE, 17% protein, 1% lysine, etc., SID lysine, and at a price of around $382 a tonne. And this is presuming all these prices that I've assumed over here, and these may or may not be relevant to your circumstance. You may have to do this exercise for yourself to ascertain what the relative value is. But I think you'll find that if you do reformulate a diet, you can use the sprouted wheat quite freely. And in this instance, I've gone up to 70% inclusion of the wheat and kept the other byproducts to a relatively modest amount. And in this instance, there's a significant cost saving here of the order of $30. And but of course, that cost saving is dependent on the differential here between corn and the wheat. But the wheat, of course, does provide a degree of protein. And as a consequence of that, you see that the diet uses less soybean to meet the protein requirements of the diet specification. It may be that you don't wish to do a total replacement of the corn with wheat. You could do a partial replacement, as I've done in this exercise here. And again, there may still be a significant cost saving associated with even just a partial replacement of the corn with sprouted wheat. So to conclude, in most instances, sprouted wheat has an equivalent nutritional value to normal wheat and can be used freely as a stock feed component as long as all the standard quality parameters are in place. That is, we check the test weight, the moisture, the protein, etc. The falling number test is of no consequence. We don't even need to concern ourselves with it at all. And as sprouted grains are not eligible for milling grade premiums, they are discounted into feed grade and are generally very competitive with other feed grain alternatives, and in particular, in the current market situation, corn. And so I think it's worth considering as a potential alternative for corn in stock feed diets in Thailand. Thank you. Oh, just as I finish my section here, I'd like to hand over now to Steve Little, who will give you the perspective of these weather damaged grains as they relate to the feeding of ruminants. Over to you, Steve.
Thanks very much, Tony. Good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure to be part of this webinar. So as Lloyd has explained, this year in many grain growing regions of Australia, we've got crops that have been impacted by rain events, and we've seen downgrading of some Australian grains, and that does create good buying opportunities for grain users that are feeding grain for livestock. So for those feeding cattle, taking advantage of those buying opportunities may involve firstly changing from one type of grain, such as corn, to another, such as wheat or barley, and changing from a sound grain to a grain that is to some extent weather damaged. So there's really three key questions that I want to address in this presentation. Firstly, if it is cost effective to do so, of course, how should you go about changing from one type of grain to another safely and effectively in a ration fed to a dairy or beef herd? Secondly, how well do cattle perform when they're fed sprouted wheat? And the third question, what potential risks are associated with feeding weather damaged grains to cattle, and how should these risks be managed? So the first question, in terms of how we go about changing the grain type, the answer is simply that we need to do it in a series of stages. So not abruptly, but in a series of stages. So for example, if we were to change the grain source within our cattle ration from corn to wheat, we would move to a blend of 2/3 corn, 1/3 wheat for say 2 weeks. Then we would move to a blend of 1/3 corn, 2/3 wheat, and then we'd move across to the wheat diet, whilst maintaining our daily feeding rate of good quality forage and maintaining our daily feeding rate of grain. Now, why do we have to take such a careful approach? Well, as we all know, cattle are ruminants, and the secret to getting optimal milk production, growth, and feed conversion from a beef or dairy cow steer is to look after these guys, the microbes in the rumen, because they are the secret to the animal's health and performance. So as Tony has said, pigs and poultry require nutrients, not specific ingredients, and it's certainly that applies to cattle as well. So when we're formulating rations for cattle, really our aims are to meet the animal's daily nutrient requirements for a particular level of production or growth without any excesses, within the feed intake limit of the animals, with good feed efficiency, and with an optimal ration cost and income minus feed cost. So the nutrients that we're really focused on delivering are fibre, so NDF, starch and sugars, protein, and of course our macro and micro minerals. So in depending on what part of the world you're in, you can achieve those nutritional aims with a variety of different cereal grains. So really, the type of ingredient is not what the animal is concerned about. Now, Tony presented this table of showing the nutritional value of the different grains. So this is the same table, and he pointed out the differences between corn and wheat, barley and sorghum in terms of protein content and fat content, and the differences in fibre content between the grains. But what I've added here at the bottom is the ruminant metabolizable energy values. So you can see, I hope you're able to read these small numbers here. The ME value of wheat is almost that of corn. And then just below that, we have barley, and then below that, sorghum. And again, these are just typical values. But when it comes to ruminant animals, it's a little bit more complicated than that. We also have to think about the structure of the starch within those grains, because that does differ. So here we have wheat, barley, sorghum, and corn. And if we look at an electron micrograph of each of those grains, you'll see that the starch granules, which are these large round structures here, you'll see that in wheat and barley, they're quite loose. So there's quite an open structure here. The starch granules are quite freely arranged in this protein matrix. But with sorghum and corn, you'll see that the starch granules are more deeply encased in the protein matrix in the case of sorghum, and the vitreous matrix in the case of corn. So this has implications for us in terms of how we go about processing grains, different grains, for optimal digestibility in cattle. And we tend to refer to corn and sorghum as the slow grains, and wheat and barley as the fast or the rapid grains in terms of the rate of digestion. So if I just move to the next slide, you can see here that it's not just a function of the different types of grains, it's also the processing methods that are applied. So if we look here, you'll notice, say, for barley, that here we have whole barley, and then temper rolled barley, dry rolled barley, steam rolled barley. So the different processing methods have implications in terms of how fast the rumen microbes ferment the starch in the grain, and also the extent to which the starch and also protein is degraded within the rumen, as opposed to further down the animal's digestive tract. So for example, we've got dry rolled barley, 80.7% is degraded in the rumen, but if we ground the barley, that would be 88% in the rumen. Now it's interesting with ground corn, you can see that a large proportion of it is digested post-ruminally, and that's really because a lot of it is washed through the rumen before it's digested. So our aim when we're processing grains is to avoid over-processing, because that will increase the rate of ruminal degradation, and it will increase the risk of ruminal acidosis, which we don't want. We also want to avoid under-processing, because that will reduce the digestibility of the starch, not only in the rumen, but in the total digestive tract of the animal. And if that's the case, then this is what we're likely to see. So in this photo here, this is a photo of the manure, and you can see these undigested grain kernels distributed in the manure. So that's a loss of starch to the animal, and it's a loss of money for the producer through a reduction in milk production, feed efficiency. There are other tests that we can also do to check that we're processing the grain adequately. And another test would be to actually do a manure, analyze the manure for starch, because we shouldn't see too much in there. So for wheat, dry coarse rolling is sufficient. For barley, perhaps coarse to medium rolling is sufficient. We don't need to apply heat and pressure necessarily. And I guess the point I'm getting to now is with sprouted wheat or barley, the process is exactly the same as Tony has said. We just treat sprouted wheat the way we would normally treat normal wheat, whether we're using a roller mill, a disc mill, or a hammer mill to process that grain. But of course, with sorghum, as I've spoken about in a separate webinar, we need to apply heat and pressure to increase the digestibility of the starch in the sorghum, and steam flaking is the preferred processing method there. So opportunities to use Australian wheat and barley in Asian cattle rations, certainly as a primary starch source, or as a complementary starch source with corn or other other ingredients. And wheat and barley have the advantage of enabling you to achieve a better balance of rapidly, moderately, and slowly degrading starch sources in the rumen when they're fed in combination with corn. And just having that extra bit of starch being degraded in the rumen can help increase the assimilation of rumen degradable protein in the diet as microbial protein, which is the most valuable protein source for the animal. And in the process of using wheat or barley with its higher protein content, we may also be able to reduce the inputs of some of the costly protein sources that we might use, like soybean meal or other protein meals. So it's no surprise then that in Australia, wheat and barley are the predominant grains used in cattle, just because of their high digestibility and their protein, and also their amino acid profile is favourable, and they're easy to handle and store, and generally they've got a very low mycotoxin risk, and they don't require much in the way of processing. We just simply have to reduce the particle size. Now with sorghum, sorghum can also substitute corn in a cattle diet, and just as per wheat and barley, there's many studies that show that it can substitute for corn without any losses in terms of performance, be that daily gain, milk production. And again, the extra protein is useful, but it's also possible to use a combination of perhaps steam flake sorghum and steam flake corn. And you can also use sorghum in combination with barley or wheat. Just a comment that I've put in here about canola meal, that there's many studies that have been done around the world showing that canola meal can replace soybean meal in dairy cow diets with, in fact, many positive milk responses, as you can see in the chart up here. So canola meal is a well-balanced source of protein, which helps stimulate that microbial protein synthesis in the rumen. It's got relatively high concentrations of lysine, methionine, and histidine. And we also know that canola meal increases the buffering capacity in the rumen, and it also stimulates the animal's feed intake. So it's therefore quite a useful protein meal, and it's also very useful in calf diets and transition cow diets. Now let's just talk about sprouted wheat for a few minutes now. What we have here are some laboratory studies where they germinated wheat and barley for periods from 16 to 48 hours, and then they dried the kernels to stop the germination process. But as you can see here, over time, the falling number has reduced, but there's been no loss in the starch and sugar content of the kernels. So again, it's getting back to the point that Tony made, that the nutritional value of sprouted wheat is unchanged until we get to the point where the shoot emerges, and certainly from that point onwards, we will then get some significant changes in the nutritional value of the grain kernels. The other point to make here is that starch becomes more accessible to the rumen microbes, and also the animal's own digestive enzymes in the small intestine. So that does present a small increase in risk of ruminal acidosis that we just have to be conscious of if we're feeding high levels of grain in the diet. But I guess the most important point to make is that across a number of feeding trials conducted in Canada and the United States, and certainly in our field experience in Australia, we've found no difference in animal performance or feed conversion efficiency when cattle were fed wheat with up to 60% of all the kernels sprouted. So as Tony said, sprouted wheat is nutritionally equivalent to normal wheat. And that applies to cattle as it does to pigs and poultry. So therefore, when wheat is downgraded based on the falling number test, which really doesn't have any relevance for us in animal nutrition, it does present a good opportunity to achieve the same animal performance potential at a lower price, lower cost per unit energy and protein. Now, getting to my third question, what potential risks are associated with feeding weather damaged grains to cattle, and how should we manage these risks? Well, there really are two potential risks. The first is molds and mycotoxins, and spoilage and mold growth may occur if the grain is stored at higher than 12.5% moisture. And the molds that we'll tend to see in grain, in wheat, for example, it tend to be the fusarium molds, which produce the mycotoxins such as DON, or vomitoxin, and also zearalenone. Now, although cattle have a innately greater resistance to mycotoxins than pigs or poultry, we still need to be cautious about mycotoxins because they can potentially reduce productivity and health problems. And the other thing about molds is that they will, over time, reduce the starch and the protein content of the grain. So this is what we would see with moldy grain, these sort of pale discoloration, or it might even be quite dark, and you may pick up an off smell as well. So if there's any concern that grain is moldy, the first initial check that's worth doing is a total mold and yeast count. And if I send that to a laboratory, that's an easy test to have done. And if the total mold and yeast count is over a few 100,000, then there's enough that would trigger enough concern to go ahead and do further tests to identify the type of mold and test for specific mycotoxins. Ruminal acidosis is a second potential risk. As I said before, germination increases the access of rumen microbes to the starch, but we have to keep that in proportion to all the other risk factors for ruminal acidosis that we live with day to day, and they're the herd factors like variation in animal body weight and stage of lactation, some feed factors like the level of processing, the feeding rate, what other starch and sugar sources are being fed, how much fiber and protein is in the diet, and then there's a number of feeding management factors that are also important as well. So I don't want to sort of overemphasize that risk of ruminal acidosis. It fits within all these other risks that we need to be managing anyway. So in terms of, sorry, I'm having a bit of trouble with the slides here. Just trying to get back to the second last slide. One more. So yeah, quality checks on receival of grain. all very slow. I don't know why. Obviously, collect a representative sample, do a visual assessment, assess the extent of sprouting. So it's about what proportion of grain kernels show signs of sprouting and what's the extent of sprouting, the stage of sprouting. Has the shoot emerged or not? Check for any mold growth. Measure the test weight, measure the moisture content, and then conduct all the other usual quality checks that you would do, like the percent screenings, the presence of insects, weed seeds, and foreign matter, just the usual quality checks. So in terms of how we go about feeding weather damaged grain, obviously, as we always do, we feed by weight, not by volume. I would recommend that you gradually, by blending it with your current grain, perhaps starting at 20% and then moving upwards, probably feeding it at no more than 40% of the total diet, introducing it gradually, as I talked about at the beginning of my presentation. It's always good practice, I think, to include buffers and rumen modifiers in cattle rations to help manage the herd's ruminal acidosis risk. I think it's also good practice to consider including a mycotoxin binder in the ration. And of course, whenever we're changing the rations of beef or dairy cattle, we're always monitoring the animals closely for any indication of feed rejection or ill thrift or fall in production or any other changes in the animal's productivity and health. So just to sum up, where are we here? We just need to be conscious that cattle are ruminant animals, and we need to feed the microbes as well as the animal itself. Animals require nutrients. The weather damaged grains that we've been talking about do present an opportunity to provide energy and protein at less cost. And sprouted wheat is comparable in nutritional value to unsprouted wheat with the same animal performance. And I guess one of the advantages of wheat and barley is that we don't need to process it as much as we do corn. Dry rolling is generally sufficient. And as I said, we need, when we're changing diets, say from corn to wheat and barley or sorghum as the predominant grain, we should do it progressively in a series of steps to avoid any rumen upsets or dysfunction. So thank you very much, and I will now hand you back to Mary.
Thanks, Steve. Terrific, Steve. Thank you very much. And also thank you to Tony and Lloyd for our presentations. Now we're leading into our question time. So if you've got any questions, could you enter it into the Q&A box? And while you're taking your time to enter into the Q&A box, I've got a few questions. So I'm just going to get everybody to bring their cameras back on. And Lloyd, you're up first. So thank you very much. We've received on the registration a couple of questions, Lloyd. And one is, what volume of sprouted wheat are you expecting to be exported out of Australia, given the year that we're having?
Good question, that one, Mary. We're 20% of the way through harvest. We've got a fair bit to go, so there's still some variables. In answering it, I kind of do it in a couple of ways and saying it isn't just sprouted wheat. It is that there's sprouted wheat and there's low protein wheat. I think the amount of sprouted wheat that we're going to see because the sprouted wheat in itself is really quite specific to just the East Coast. And there's an amount of sprouted wheat, but the crop size, particularly in New South Wales, which is the biggest production state on the East Coast, that's going to be down 20 to 30% on last year. So even if there is sprouted wheat, the domestic market is going to be grabbing that before it goes to export. So that's one thing that we've got to take into account. So just because it's sprouted doesn't mean it necessarily flows into export markets. And so I'm thinking that the export volume out of the East Coast is likely to be down on last year. But looking more broadly than that, Western Australia has got probably an equally sized large crop of wheat last year as to what it was last year, and the quality profile from what I've seen so far looks to be quite similar to last year. So we've already seen probably over the past couple of months that there's been feed wheat being sold out of Australia. My expectation is a lot of that feed wheat that's coming out of Australia that's been sold into Southeast Asia, whether it be Thailand, whether it be Philippines, South Korea, is actually being priced out of low protein wheat out of WA. So whilst we can focus just on the sprouted wheat, I think that in itself probably down a little bit on last year, but I think we're still going to see large volumes of lower protein wheat finding its way out into the Southeast Asian feed wheat markets.
Something to look out for. So thank you for that, Lloyd. Tony, I've just got a couple of questions for you that have come in. One says, I assume then that it's better to have higher protein feed wheat that may be slightly sprouted than lower protein milling wheat that is unsprouted. I'll read that one again. I assume that it is better to have higher protein feed wheat that may be slightly sprouted than lower protein milling wheat that is unsprouted.
Well, I think that's an awkward one to answer to some extent, because there's several things to consider here. The protein content is one thing, and the energy value is another. The energy value between the two doesn't vary, so that's not a problem. So the protein content is of some value. We usually value each percentage protein unit at around about $5 per tonne of grain. Whereas the energy value is far more valuable, being about $30 per megajoule of digestible energy. So in that instance, we're not really that focused on the grain protein content as a major item. We get our protein generally from other sources. It is helpful, but it's not critical to the overall equation. So I think in that instance, you would just have to sum up each of those options independently and look at the value that they represent nutritionally relative to their cost. And I don't think you can sort of make a general rule as to which of those two would be the better option.
Okay, thanks, Tony. And as mentioned throughout this presentation, we've got a lot of feed. We potentially have the feed grain, and the sprouted wheat is naturally occurring. There's a question here, Tony. Is sprouted wheat included in the AusCan calibration?
Yes, it is. And in fact, we took the opportunity this last year, where there was so much sprouted grain around, to take samples across the full spectrum of the degree of sprouting and to incorporate them into the AusCan calibration. So this has made the AusCan calibration that much more robust, and it does extend its coverage of all types of different grains, including sprouted grains. So yes, it is very much in tune with, or should give a very accurate result on sprouted grain.
And as Lloyd had just said, we're only 20% into our harvest. We're still not certain what percentage of sprouted grain will be around, but there is a question that has popped up. How do you measure energy for sprouted grain?
How do you measure it? Well, the measure that we would use today is the AusScan NIR, or near infrared reflectance assay. This gives an immediate, real-time, comprehensive assessment of not only the energy value, but all the proximate analyses as well, the moisture, the protein, the fibre, the starch content, the non-starch polysaccharide content, etc. It gives a very comprehensive profile of the nutritive value. But other than that, if you don't have that available to you, then you can do those proximate analyses in the lab and construct an energy value by regression against each of those parameters. It's somewhat less accurate, but it does give you a fairly good indication, and you can grade different samples at least proportional to one another, even if you can't get a precise energy value on each of them. The test weight, to some extent, is an indicator of energy value. If the test weight is high, you can be reasonably confident the energy value will be high. But as the test weight declines, it doesn't necessarily mean that the energy value declines. There's reasons for why the test weight might come down that's not necessarily related to the nutrient composition within the seed. So basically the standard tests are that you would do the proximate analysis, you'd get the fat, the protein, the fibre, and the starch, and then you can calculate an energy value from that.
Okay, thanks, Tony. And we know that sprouted grain is determined by falling number assessment, and for stock feed that is not an issue. So just going to reel into Steve Little, there's a couple of questions that have come in. What is considered the maximum percentage of wheat to include in cattle diets that is safe and cost effective?
I would favour probably up to about 40% of the diet, but it really does depend on a number of factors. It depends on what other starch and sugar sources are in the diet, the quality of the fibre in the diet in terms of its digestibility and function, all those factors that I mentioned that impact on the overall risk of ruminal acidosis. So, for example, if we had a herd of dairy cattle that had large variation in their body weight within the herd, and we didn't have very good control over how many kilos of feed or grain per day each of those animals was consuming, and let's say the wheat was also over processed, then I'd be much more conservative in terms of the feeding rate of wheat than if all those factors were well controlled.
Okay. And just following up on that, Steve, for your response there, is it worth including a buffer additive in the ration when feeding high levels of wheat or barley?
Yes, but I don't think certainly valuable, and it's not expensive to do so, but we don't want to over rely on it. Really, the best buffer that we have available to us is the cow's own saliva, and so therefore what we're trying to do when we're designing rations for cattle is to ensure that they're chewing and producing lots of saliva, because that has natural bicarbonate in it as a buffer. Okay, but it never does any harm to include either a food grade sodium bicarbonate in the ration, perhaps up to say 1%, 0.81%. But these days there are good commercial buffers, products that can also have the bonus of containing some calcium and magnesium, and they can be used at lower inclusion rates.
Thanks, Steve. Now we know that corn is a common and widely used commodity in feed rations, but if switching cattle from corn to a wheat-based diets, will we see changes in the animal's appetite?
No, we shouldn't. We shouldn't, provided that we, as I said, we do it in steps, and we we look after the microbes that are in the animal's rumen. If we look after those guys, we should have a very smooth transition.
Okay, thanks, Steve. There's just double check if there's any questions coming in on the chat. No, we've got one more question before we wrap up today. And Steve, I'm going to throw it back to you. What is when you look at feed grains and how they're different and how they're formed, what is the influence of sprouted wheat on pellet quality, durability, and level of fines?
Well, I think, as Tony said, it really doesn't. It's really not. There's not a significant impact. I mean, we're fortunate with wheat and barley. You know, they've got a lot of starch in there that is gelatinized during the steam pelleting process in the feed mill, and provided that is still present, we'll produce a good robust pellet. So unless there's a lot of very small, thin grains that are hard to roll, yeah, I don't think that's a big concern for us.
Okay,
and I think that's our experience, Tony, isn't it? It's not.
Yeah, I would sort of confirm that. Yeah, there are other factors in the diet that we can employ. You know, there's gluten fractions and things that help to stick the seed together, other pectins and the like. But also too, even if it does lower or there's a lower level of gelatinizable starch, it just is a matter of adjusting the pelleting parameters in your system, in changing the conditioning times and the throughput rates, and maybe the parameters on the die, etc., to fix it up. It's just within the normal stock feed milling parameters, I guess, to adjust to the materials you're working with and produce the quality you want.
Terrific. Thank you, Steve. Thanks, Tony. And Lloyd, we don't have any more questions coming in, so we might wrap this webinar up. We'd like to thank everybody for coming online. Unfortunately, the Australian Agricultural Council for Thailand is unable to join us. She sends her regards. Today's webinar wouldn't be possible without the support of the Australian government, such as Austrade and Department of Agriculture, Fisheries and Forestry, and their project ATMAC that has supported this webinar for our friends there in Thailand. So thank you everybody for coming online. Now, I've been asked where to and what's next with AGIC. So following this webinar, we're going to send out the recording for everybody that has come online. This will be also available on the AGIC website, and as Tony had referred to it, and likewise Steve during the presentations, so you can see a lot of our content on feed grains and sprouted wheats on our webinar if you'd like to go back to that. I'd like to thank our comms team and our IT support for the event, but most of all, I'd like to thank you people for and our friends here in Thailand for actually coming online. We're really pleased to see so many people participate and show so much interest in the Australian grain, especially wheat and barley. Now we're just about ready to close out. So we have a poll for today's event. So I've got Sean in our communications team will just launch it now. If you could participate in the poll, that provides us the feedback to ensure that we are providing content that is valuable and insightful to consumers of Australian grain, and we look forward to your response. In the meantime, I think that's a wrap from the Australian grains industry for feed grains and sprouted wheat. We will see you in the new year. All the best for the rest of the season. Take care. Signing out.